Welcome back, everybody, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going deep on occupational fraud.
Yeah, diving into the 2024 report to the nations.
That's right, from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, the ACFE.
This report analyzes real cases of fraud from around the world
Almost 2,000 cases.
to give us a picture of just how big this problem is.
Across 138 countries, with a total of, get this, over $3.1 billion in losses.
An average loss of $1.7 million per case.
That's huge.
And that's really just the tip of the iceberg.
Right, because so much fraud goes undetected.
So this deep dive is all about equipping you with the knowledge to understand
Then protect yourself.
from this kind of fraud.
So let's get right into it.
We'll be looking at the types of fraud, who's committing it,
How it's concealed.
and what you can do to prevent it.
Okay, let's start with the cost of occupational fraud.
Well, CFEs estimate that organizations lose 5% of their revenue to fraud every year.
5%, that's a lot.
It is, and if you extrapolate that to the entire global GDP,
I can't even imagine.
you're talking about trillions of dollars in losses. Wow, okay, so what kinds of fraud make up these losses?
The report divides occupational fraud into three main categories: asset misappropriation, corruption,
Okay,
and financial statement fraud.
let's break those down, starting with asset misappropriation.
Asset misappropriation basically comes down to employees stealing or misusing a company's resources.
Like what?
Skimming cash, submitting fake expenses.
Or just walking off with office supplies.
Exactly. Now, this is the most common type of occupational fraud.
Yeah, the report said 89% of the cases were asset misappropriation.
Right, but that doesn't mean the losses are small.
So how much are we talking about?
Well, the median loss per case is $120,000.
Okay, that's still a lot of money.
It is. And the report has this thing called the fraud tree to help understand the different types of asset misappropriation schemes.
So it's like a cheat sheet for fraud.
Exactly.
So what are some of the schemes people should be looking out for?
Some of the most common ones are check tampering,
Okay.
billing schemes, and stealing non-cash assets.
So things like forging checks, creating fake invoices.
Or walking off with company laptops.
Makes sense. Okay, what about corruption? How is that different?
Corruption is when somebody abuses their position of power for personal gain.
So we're talking about things like bribes, kickbacks.
Conflicts of interest, that sort of thing.
Yeah, how common is that?
Well, more common than you might think.
Really?
Almost half the cases in the report involved corruption.
Wow.
And the median loss is $200,000 per case.
That's almost twice as high as asset misappropriation.
Yeah, and one of the things that I found fascinating in the data is how much the percentage of corruption cases varies by region.
Oh, interesting.
Southern Asia has the highest percentage of corruption cases,
How high are we talking?
74%,
Wow.
while the U.S. and Canada have the lowest at 35%.
Huh, that's a huge difference.
It makes you think about the different cultural and legal factors at play.
Definitely. Okay, so we've got asset misappropriation, which is common but costly, and then corruption, which is even more costly.
And that brings us to the heavy hitter of occupational fraud, financial statement fraud.
This is where we see the really big numbers, right?
Exactly. This is the kind of fraud that can bring down companies.
Like Enron.
Exactly. So we're talking about things like cooking the books
Okay.
and flatting revenue numbers, hiding losses.
So basically making a company's financials look better than they actually are.
Exactly.
Okay.
And while it's not as common as the other types of fraud,
Only 5% of cases, according to the report.
right, but the median loss is a whopping $766,000.
Wow. So more than 6 times higher than asset misappropriation.
Yeah. And the other interesting thing about financial statement fraud is that it's almost always accompanied by other types of fraud as well.
So it's not just one scheme, it's like a whole web of deceit.
Exactly.
Okay, so we know the different types of fraud, but how long do these schemes typically go on before they're discovered?
Well, the report found that the typical fraud lasts for about 12 months before being detected.
A whole year. That's a long time.
It is, and longer it goes on, the higher the losses.
Right, because they just keep stealing more and more.
The report found that if a fraud goes on for 5 years or more, the median loss is $875,000.
Oof. So time is really of the essence.
It is. And the report also talks about something called the velocity of a fraud scheme.
Velocity.
Yeah, it basically refers to how quickly the losses add up over time.
So some schemes are slow burns and others are like a sudden explosion.
Exactly. And the report found that financial statement fraud and corruption have the highest velocity.
So the losses pile up more quickly with those types of fraud.
Right. And another thing that can really accelerate the velocity is collusion,
Collusion.
when multiple people are working together to commit the fraud.
So it's like a team effort.
Right, and when you have more people involved, the speed and damage really multiply.
How much faster are we talking?
Well, frauds with 3 or more people involved had a velocity of $23,500 per month.
Wow, so more than double the velocity of frauds committed by just one person. We can't talk about fraud these days without talking about COVID-19. Did the pandemic have an impact on all of this?
It definitely did.
Really?
Yeah, 53% of the cases they studied had at least one pandemic-related factor that contributed to the fraud.
So more than half the cases had some tie to the pandemic. What kind of factors are we talking about?
Things like all the organizational changes, the shift to remote work,
Yeah.
and all those supply chain disruptions.
It's like it created a perfect storm for fraudsters.
It really did, and unfortunately, the median loss for fraud actually increased during the pandemic.
Really?
And what's really concerning is that the detection time stayed about the same.
So even with everything going on, companies weren't any faster at catching these fraudsters.
Unfortunately not.
It makes you wonder if companies were just letting their guard down because they're dealing with so much.
Or if the fraudsters were just more emboldened during this time.
Either way, it's pretty alarming. So they're getting away with it, at least for a while, but how do they do it? How do they conceal their activities?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. The report found that 89% of cases involved at least one concealment tactic.
So almost all of these fraudsters are actively trying to cover their tracks.
They are. And a lot of that involves manipulating documents.
Really? You mean physical documents? I would have thought most of this would be happening online.
You'd think so, but the most common concealment tactics involve creating fraudulent physical documents
Oh, wow.
and altering existing ones.
So forging signatures, creating fake invoices.
Exactly. Good old-fashioned paper still matters.
Huh. Who knew? But of course, they're using technology too, right?
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about hackers deleting files, creating false entries in databases,
Okay.
and finding new ways to exploit vulnerabilities.
I bet that's a full-time job in itself, just trying to keep up with all that.
It is. And cryptocurrency is becoming a tool for fraudsters, too.
Really? So they're using cryptocurrency to hide their tracks?
Exactly. About 4% of the cases involved cryptocurrency, and they were using it mainly to convert stolen assets or make illicit payments.
So they're basically using it to launder money and make it harder to track their activities.
Exactly.
It sounds like a constant cat and mouse game.
It really is. As technology advances, the fraudsters find new ways to use it, and we have to constantly adapt to stay ahead of them.
So how do we catch these guys? What usually tips people off that something's not right?
Well, the most common way these frauds are detected is through tips.
Tips.
Yeah, tips accounted for 43% of all the cases.
So someone sees something suspicious and reports it.
Exactly. It could be an employee, a customer, a vendor.
Anyone, really.
Right. Anyone who notices something that just doesn't seem right.
So having a system in place where people can safely and confidentially report those suspicions is really important.
It is. And the report actually found that having a hotline nearly doubles the chance of a fraud being detected via tip.
That makes sense. If you know you can speak up without fear of retaliation, you're more likely to come forward.
Absolutely.
So what about the other 57% of cases, the ones that aren't detected through tips? How are those usually discovered?
Well, there are other methods like audits and data analysis.
So companies need to be actively looking for signs of fraud themselves.
They do. These proactive approaches are really key for minimizing losses.
It's like having a good security system. You're not just reacting to a break-in, you're actively trying to deter it.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the types of fraud, how it's detected, but now I'm curious about the victims. Are certain organizations more likely to be targeted than others?
Well, while no organization is completely immune to fraud,
Right.
the report did find that certain types and sizes of companies are more likely to be hit.
Like bigger companies are bigger targets.
In some ways, yes. Organizations with over $1 billion in revenue had the highest median loss.
Which makes sense. More to steal.
Right, but smaller companies are actually more vulnerable to things like check tampering and skimming.
So the type of fraud varies depending on the size of the company.
It does, and it also depends on the industry and the types of assets a company has.
That makes sense. Okay, so we've talked about the victims now. Let's turn our attention to the perpetrators. Who are these people? Is there like a typical profile of a fraudster?
Well, there's no one-size-fits-all profile,
Right.
but the report does reveal some interesting patterns.
Okay, so what kind of patterns are we talking about?
Well, for starters, most fraudsters are employees or managers.
Okay.
although frauds committed by owners or executives cause the largest losses.
So the higher up you are, the more damage you can do.
Yeah, the median loss for frauds committed by owners executives was $500,000.
That's more than 8 times higher than frauds committed by employees.
It is, and the report also found that the longer a perpetrator works for a company,
Okay.
the more expensive the fraud tends to be.
So tenure plays a role.
It does. Employees with 10 years or more of tenure
Wow.
resulted in a median loss of $250,000.
So loyalty doesn't necessarily equal honesty.
Unfortunately not.
What about men versus women?
The report found that men commit more fraud overall
Okay.
and cause higher losses.
That's not surprising.
But here's the interesting thing. At the employee level, women are actually more common as perpetrators.
Really? I wouldn't have guessed that.
Yeah, and women at the employee level also cause higher median losses than their male counterparts.
Huh, that's interesting. I wonder what that says about the pressures and opportunities men and women face at work.
Definitely something to think about.
What about age? Does that play a role?
It does. Older fraudsters tend to cause the largest losses.
Interesting.
Those over 60 caused a median loss of $675,000.
Wow, so experience really can be a double-edged sword.
It can, and it just underscores the need for strong oversight and accountability at every level.
What about education? Does that have any correlation?
Well, over 2/3 of fraudsters have at least a university degree.
So education doesn't equal ethics.
It seems not. And the higher the level of education, the higher the median losses.
Wow, that's pretty sobering.
It is. It just goes to show that fraud can happen anywhere, by anyone.
Okay, and I know sometimes these frauds aren't just one person acting alone. What happens when you have multiple people working together?
Yeah, when you have collusion, the cost of the fraud goes way up.
Like how much higher are we talking?
Frauds involving 3 or more people caused median losses of $329,000.
That's more than 4 times higher than frauds committed by a single person.
Exactly. And these group efforts are usually much harder to catch.
So what can be done to detect those kinds of schemes?
Oh, that's a great question, and one that we'll dive into further in the next part of our deep dive.
Stay tuned, folks. We'll be back with more from the 2024 report to the nations. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been talking about who commits fraud, what kind of fraud they commit.
And how much it all costs.
Right, but now I'm curious about what happens after someone gets caught.
That's an important question, because detecting the fraud is just the first step.
Right.
What happens next? What actions are taken? And can the organization recover?
So walk us through it. What happens to these fraudsters once they're caught?
Well, not surprisingly, the most common consequence is termination.
Yeah, I would imagine so.
68% of perpetrators were fired.
Okay, but what about legal action? Do these cases usually end up in court?
Well, it depends. 57% of the cases in the report were referred to law enforcement.
For criminal prosecution.
Right, and of those referrals, 72% resulted in a conviction.
So there's a good chance that justice will be served.
There is, but it's not always that straightforward.
Right, so what are some of the reasons why a company might not pursue legal action?
Well, sometimes they feel like handling it internally is enough.
So they rely on disciplinary actions rather than legal proceedings.
Exactly. In fact, almost half of the companies in the report cited internal discipline as the reason for not going to the authorities.
That makes sense. Sometimes it might be about protecting the company's reputation.
Oh, absolutely. Fear of
Yep.
bad publicity was another major reason.
Yeah, who wants to air their dirty laundry in public?
About a third of the companies mentioned that.
Okay, so it's a tough call for these companies, weighing the damage to their reputation against the need for justice.
It is a difficult balance.
But let's talk about the money for a second. Can companies ever recover the funds they lost to fraud?
Well, it's tough, but not impossible.
So is there any way to know how often companies are actually able to recover their losses?
It really depends on a lot of factors,
Like what?
like the type of fraud, how much was stolen,
Okay.
and whether the perpetrator has any assets to seize.
Right, so you might catch them, but if they've already spent all the money...
Then it's gone.
Right, it sounds like the best strategy is to just prevent the fraud from happening in the first place.
You're absolutely right. Prevention is always better than cure.
So let's talk about that. What are some things companies can do to prevent fraud?
Well, strong anti-fraud controls are essential.
Like what kinds of controls?
Things like background checks on potential employees,
Okay.
segregation of duties.
So no one person has too much control.
Exactly.
What else?
Regular audits, both internal and external.
So you're checking the books and making sure everything's on the up and up.
Exactly.
And a strong code of ethics.
Right. Setting a clear tone at the top that fraud will not be tolerated.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the global picture of fraud, but I'm curious about regional differences. Does the report dive into that at all?
It does. Fraud is a global problem,
Yeah.
but it manifests in different ways depending on where you are in the world.
So like those dishes that taste different depending on what region you're in.
Exactly.
Okay, so where should we start our culinary tour of fraud?
Well, let's kick things off in the Asia-Pacific region. Tons of growth there, but also a diverse cultural landscape.
So what did they find about occupational fraud in that part of the world?
Well, corruption was particularly prevalent there.
Not surprising given the fast growth and sometimes relaxed regulations.
The median loss for corruption cases in Asia-Pacific was $200,000.
Okay, and how common was asset misappropriation in that region?
Pretty common, with a median loss of $120,000.
So you've got high-level corruption and more everyday theft.
Makes sense given how diverse the region is.
What about detection? How are these schemes usually uncovered in Asia-Pacific?
The most common way was through tips, just like the global trend,
Okay.
then internal audits and management review.
So pretty similar to what we see elsewhere.
Yeah, but there's a cultural element to consider as well.
What do you mean?
Well, in some cultures, there can be a reluctance to report wrongdoing, especially if it involves someone in a position of authority.
That's understandable. It can be seen as disrespectful or disloyal.
Exactly. So building trust and making sure those reporting mechanisms are sensitive to cultural norms is really important.
Okay, let's move on. Where to next on our fraud tour?
Let's head over to Eastern Europe and Western and Central Asia next.
A region with some unique political and economic dynamics.
Right, and the fraud landscape definitely reflects that.
So what stands out about this region?
Financial statement fraud.
Really?
The median loss for financial statement fraud in this region is $1 million.
$1 million?
Yeah, way higher than the global average.
Wow. Any theories on why that might be?
It's hard to say for sure, but it could have to do with the concentration of wealth in certain industries or weaker corporate governance structures in some of the countries in the region.
So the context really matters.
It does, and corruption was also a big problem in this region,
Yeah, I would imagine so.
with a median loss of $200,000.
Okay, so similar to Asia-Pacific in that you've got high-level corruption and routine theft.
Exactly.
What about detection? Anything unusual there?
Interestingly, internal audits were the most common detection method in this region.
Really?
Yeah, followed by tips and then management review.
So it seems like they might be relying more on internal controls than other parts of the world.
Could be due to differences in the legal and regulatory environment.
Makes sense. Okay, next stop.
Let's go to Latin America and the Caribbean.
A region with a long history of corruption.
Exactly. And the report shows that it's still a big problem today.
So how much of the fraud in this region involved corruption?
Over half the cases.
Wow.
And the median loss was $250,000.
That's a lot of money.
It is. It suggests that corruption is really deeply ingrained in parts of this region.
And I'm guessing they saw a lot of asset misappropriation there, too.
Yes. The median loss for asset misappropriation was $181,000.
It's striking how those numbers can vary so much from region to region.
It is. The context really matters.
So how are they dealing with this problem in Latin America and the Caribbean? What are the main detection methods?
Again, tips were the most common method,
Okay.
followed by internal audit and management review.
So pretty standard, but it sounds like they're really emphasizing the importance of ethics and compliance in this region.
Yeah, they're really trying to create a culture where people are less likely to commit fraud in the first place.
So it's not just about catching the bad guys, it's about preventing it from happening in the first place.
Exactly.
Okay, let's move on to the Middle East and North Africa. What's happening there?
So this is a region undergoing some big changes, both economically and politically.
Yeah.
And that's reflected in the fraud landscape.
So what did the report find?
Well, unsurprisingly, corruption was a major issue,
Okay.
with a median loss of $163,000.
And asset misappropriation.
Also common, with a median loss of $100,000.
Okay, so a familiar pattern, but I'm sure the details are unique to this region.
They are.
How are they detecting fraud in the Middle East and North Africa?
Well, again, tips were the leading method,
Okay.
followed by internal audits and management review.
So that seems to be the common thread across all the regions.
It is. Those three methods are consistently the most effective.
Okay, what about Southern Asia? We talked earlier about how that region had the highest percentage of corruption cases. What else did the report find?
Yeah, 74% of cases involve corruption there.
Wow, that's incredibly high.
And the median loss was $100,000.
So even though corruption was really common, asset misappropriation was actually more costly.
It was. The median loss for asset misappropriation in Southern Asia was $128,000.
Oh, that's interesting.
It shows that the type of fraud and the associated losses can be very nuanced.
Yeah, even within a region that's known for a particular type of fraud.
Right. What about detection? Any surprises there?
I'm going to guess tips, internal audits, and management review.
You got it.
Amazing how consistently those three methods dominate.
It really is.
Okay, let's move on to sub-Saharan Africa, a region facing some very specific challenges.
Yes. Poverty, inequality.
Weaker governance structure.
Right. All of those things contribute to the fraud landscape.
So what did the report highlight about this region?
Well, corruption was a major concern,
Okay.
with a median loss of $128,000.
And I imagine asset misappropriation was common there too.
It was. The median loss was $120,000.
So the losses for both types of fraud are pretty similar in this region.
Yeah, they're both significant problems.
What about detection? Any surprises there?
Tips, internal audits, and management review.
It's like a broken record at this point,
But it just goes to show how important those three methods are.
no matter where you are in the world.
Exactly.
Okay, let's jump across the pond now to the U.S. and Canada.
Developed economies with pretty strong anti-fraud measures in place.
So what's the fraud landscape like over there?
Well, in the U.S. and Canada, asset misappropriation was the most common type of fraud,
Okay.
with a median loss of $120,000.
What about corruption? How much of a problem is that?
It's still a concern,
Yeah.
but less prevalent than in other regions.
Makes sense given their legal and regulatory systems.
The median loss for corruption cases in the U.S. and Canada was $150,000.
So even though it was less common, the losses were still higher when it did happen.
Yeah, definitely something to keep in mind.
What about detection?
No surprises here. Tips, internal audits, and management review were the most common ways fraud was detected.
But even with those strong systems in place, the report still recommends proactive fraud detection methods.
They do. Things like data analysis,
Okay.
surprise audits.
So you catch them off guard?
Exactly. And continuous monitoring.
Okay, so you're always keeping an eye out.
Right. You're not just reacting to fraud, you're trying to anticipate it.
Like a game of chess, you got to be thinking a few moves ahead.
Exactly.
Okay, last stop on our world tour of fraud, Western Europe.
A region with a lot of economic diversity.
So I'm guessing the fraud landscape reflects that.
It does. In Western Europe, asset misappropriation was the most prevalent,
Okay.
with a median loss of $181,000.
And corruption.
Less common than in other regions, but the median loss was still pretty high at $200,000.
So even though it doesn't happen as often, the impact is still pretty big.
Yeah?
And detection.
You know, tips, internal audits, and management review.
It's amazing how consistently those three methods dominate.
It really is.
So even though there are these global trends,
Yes,
the specifics of how fraud plays out really depend on the local context.
they do. Every region has its own unique risks and challenges.
So there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Definitely not. You have to understand your own specific vulnerabilities.
Based on your industry, your location, your internal structure.
Right. You have to tailor your anti-fraud strategies accordingly.
But there's one more piece to this puzzle that we haven't talked about yet.
The human cost of fraud,
Right. The damage that goes beyond just the financial losses.
the reputational harm,
Yeah.
the erosion of trust, the emotional toll it takes on people.
So join us for the final part of our deep dive as we explore those less tangible but equally devastating consequences of occupational fraud. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been talking about the types of fraud, the people who commit it, and the money they steal.
But there's another side to this story that we haven't touched on yet.
The human cost of occupational fraud.
Right, the damage that goes beyond just the dollars and cents.
So we're talking about the broken trust, the damage to a company's reputation.
And the emotional toll it takes on everyone involved.
Let's unpack those, starting with the erosion of trust. How does fraud impact the relationships within an organization?
Well, when fraud happens, it's like a crack in the foundation of the organization.
I see what you mean.
The trust between colleagues, between management and employees.
Yeah,
between the organization and its stakeholders, it's all damaged.
and I imagine once that trust is broken, it's really hard to rebuild
It is. It takes time.
because you start questioning everyone's motives.
Exactly. It creates this atmosphere of suspicion and doubt.
And that can be really paralyzing for an organization.
It can. It's like a poison that spreads throughout the workplace.
Wow, that's a powerful image, and I bet it lingers long after the immediate crisis has passed,
It does. It can take years to restore that trust.
if it ever fully recovers at all.
Right.
Okay, let's talk about reputational damage. How does fraud impact the way an organization is viewed by the public?
Well, reputational damage can be really swift and severe.
Yeah.
One minute you're a respected business.
And the next, you're caught up in a scandal.
Exactly. And in today's digital world, news travels fast.
Oh, yeah. Social media, news websites.
It all gets amplified.
So that negative publicity can really have a ripple effect.
It can damage customer loyalty, scare off investors.
And even hurt employee morale.
It's a reminder that a good reputation takes years to build.
But it can be destroyed in an instant.
And sometimes companies try to repair the damage.
How so?
With PR campaigns, lawsuits. Sometimes they even rebrand themselves.
But even then, there's no guarantee that they'll ever fully recover.
There isn't.
It really highlights how high the stakes are.
They are.
But let's talk about the emotional toll of fraud. I think this is an aspect that's often overlooked.
It is, but it's really important.
So let's talk about it. What are some of those emotional impacts?
Well, imagine you're the victim of fraud. Someone you trusted has betrayed you.
It's got to be devastating.
You feel violated, angry, vulnerable.
That sounds incredibly traumatic.
It can be. And it's not just the direct victims who are affected.
Right, it can impact their families, their colleagues.
Even their communities.
So it creates this ripple effect of fear and anxiety.
And that can lead to all sorts of problems like decreased productivity, increased absenteeism.
And even long-term mental health issues.
It's a hidden epidemic.
So what can be done to support victims and help them through this?
It really requires a compassionate approach.
Yeah.
Providing support, encouraging open communication, and creating a workplace culture that values well-being.
So it's about recognizing that fraud isn't just about numbers.
Right.
It's about people.
It is. It has real human consequences.
Well, this deep dive into occupational fraud has been eye-opening, to say the least.
We've seen some shocking statistics, some devastating consequences.
But we've also seen how important it is to be proactive.
Exactly.
To implement strong controls, to create an ethical culture.
Because fraud is a serious problem, but it's not insurmountable.
We can't just ignore it and hope it goes away.
Right. We have to educate ourselves, stay informed, and take steps to protect ourselves.
That's great advice. Well, it's been fascinating exploring this issue with you.
Thanks for having me.
And to all our listeners out there, stay vigilant, stay informed, and stay safe.
We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.